Now I have the pleasure to welcome John Lord as our last speaker of the event. And before John comes up, I just would like to share his bio with you. John is a community researcher, author, facilitator, and leader of community change. He was founder and first director for more than a decade of the Centre for Community-Based Research in Kitchener. John has published dozens of articles and several books on research-inspired social innovation and community change. His most recent book, Facilitating an Everyday Life, outlines approaches to facilitating relationships, networks, and community connections. A bit like what we're doing here. John is also the founding partner of the Facilitation Leadership Group and is actively involved in supporting families, communities, and organisations to embrace the values, principles, and strategies required to facilitate what he calls a new story. John lives in Waterloo, where he is currently chair of the New Story Group of Waterloo Region, which is a grassroots organisation that sponsored the local Belong conversations that were held during the fall. Some of you were probably involved, and the Immigration Partnership Belong pillar was involved as well. So please join me in welcoming John.
So thank you very much for inviting me, and I hope that we can stay. People are going back to work, I guess, but if you can stay, that'd be great. This was very exciting for me to be part of this because I'm not part of your Immigration Partnership Group, so it was wonderful to hear what you're doing, and the three pillars are very powerful. In many ways, I was asked to talk about inclusion today, which is my research area. In many ways, you could think of those three pillars as being a vision for inclusion. Really, if we settle well, if we work in our community at meaningful work, and if we belong, really we have the recipe for good inclusion. And thank you for Lisette for sharing your story. It was very inspiring, and I was thinking as you were talking about your energy and your persistence, but also the anchors in our community that were able to assist you on your journey. And when we think about inclusion, in many ways that's what we're talking about. We're talking about building an inclusive community that has strong anchors for everybody. In many ways, I think your work is about belonging as the overriding kind of idea. But inclusion is really also about reducing isolation and loneliness. And I'd like you to start today by thinking about the folks that you support, but also to think more broadly, think beyond your silos in a way. Think of other folks in our community who may be lonely or isolated. Think about folks with mental health issues, people with developmental or physical disabilities, elderly people who are frail, who perhaps can't get out of the house. All of us, including immigrants, know these folks, and we all know people who are lonely or isolated. And so we need to kind of cast, I think, a large net, and I think your three pillars, in a way, are helping us to do that. So in some respects, I see your work as really about building an inclusive community where everybody belongs. So let's talk a little bit about what inclusion is. For me, it's more than integration. In some ways, we can think of integration, if we look at the actually early definitions of integration in the 70s and 80s, it was really about fitting in. It was really about how do we help people fit in, no matter who they were or where we gone. And I think what was exciting about the word inclusion, it's really more about how do we change the culture in a way so that everybody can participate and contribute. So we might think of inclusion as being the way we create opportunities and change conditions. We do both. It's both about opportunities and conditions that allow everybody to express their gifts and strengths. That was the story you just heard. The story you just heard was about how do we figure out, how do I figure out, how do we figure out how everybody can express their gifts and strengths in community. So I think the second thing I'd like to talk to you about is, it seems to me that your work, as I looked at your action plan, which is very exciting and very detailed and lots of very positive things there that you can work on together and that the community can work on with you. It seems to me that inclusion is really about change. And your work and your pillars are really about change. So what I'd like to do is talk with you about what I think are four other pillars. I want you to surround your three pillars with 4 other pillars, and I would call these the pillars of change. These are the things that I've learned over 20 or 30 years of doing research on inclusion. What are the markers that really make a difference when we build inclusive neighborhoods or inclusive organizations or inclusive communities? What are the change things that make a difference? And I would suggest to you that there are 4 of these. And the 4 are the power of the personal, the belief in community, the power of partnerships, and the wisdom of the collective. So let me talk about each of those. The power of the personal. I think that most of us, when we think about inclusion, we think about society, don't we? And we think about social change and how society has to change and organizations have to change. But in some ways, what we've really been learning over the last 30 years is that inclusion is also about each of us. It's also about our own personal journeys and the impact that we have on others. Pember Chodron, who's one of the great Buddhist teachers of our time, says, quote, "If we want peace in the world, we have to be brave enough to soften what is rigid in our hearts, to find the soft spot and to stay with it. We have to have that kind of courage and take that kind of responsibility. This is the true practice of peace." So even though we're talking about peace in the world, really peace begins with us in every step that we take. So in many ways, inclusion is inside-out work, isn't it? It's inside-out work. It begins with us and it connects with others. And let me tell you a brief story about that happened to me recently. I was doing a full-day workshop on inclusion and the whole idea of how we use network research and network theory to help build inclusive communities, inclusive neighborhoods. And this one young social service worker who was very courageous put up his hand very tentatively and he said, "John," he said, "I have a very weak network. I don't know how I could help other people develop their networks." This was very wise of him, wasn't it? This was inside-out work, struggling with his own networks, struggling with his own connections, struggling with his own identity as he's thinking about helping others. And as the day went on, you could see him growing in his energy and his ideas and his possibilities. So as you work on your action plan, and I'm going to try to link each of these to your action plan, as you work on your action plan, remember the power of the personal. And for me, I think in my own personal life over the years, it's meant 2 things. It's meant being patient, and some of you know me, I've had to work hard at that. And it's also meant being curious. So it's mean being patient with myself and my own attitudes, because sometimes we need to check in with our own attitudes, right? And it means being curious with myself about how things are shifting. What am I noticing? And also being curious with each other. So I just want to say that sometimes I think when I talk about, or when other people talk about the power of the personal, they think it means we all have to be totally compassionate with each other all the time. I love compassion. I think that's very important. But I think we also have to be a bit tough with each other. We have to be willing to ask each other hard questions. If I'm willing to ask myself hard questions, then I hope I can have the permission maybe to ask you hard questions. Because I think if inclusion is going to really be genuine, and I've been fortunate in traveling across the country and around the world studying inclusion, to see when inclusion works, you see reciprocal, genuine relationships where people honor each other and their customs and their strengths and their hopes. So that's what I would call the first pillar of change, the power of the personal. My second pillar of change would be, say, belief in community. And you know, as I studied inclusion and I see inclusion projects or inclusive communities around the world, what do I notice? They're all grounded in community. They're not grounded at some CEO's office in a corporation. They're grounded in community. So many of your goals and strategic directions, I love those today, and the action plan that I actually got to see before today. And those, so many of your strategic directions are grounded in community. So think about it, folks. In many ways, we have a vibrant community here, don't we? In many ways, we're very fortunate in Waterloo Region to have a vibrant community. Whether you define community as the thousands of associations of common interests where people gather and come together around common interests, you know, it could be fitness, it could be politics, it could be culture, it could be music. People gather all the time in this community, and communities all across Canada and around the world. People gather around common interests. Or if you define community as the rich networks that many of us are fortunate to have. However you define community, that's where inclusion needs to be grounded. I think of my friend Khalid, who came here from Syria about 10 years ago. And I won't tell you the sad story about his family in Syria now, because it's just so sad over there. But when Khalid first came here, he lived in a rooming house, and one of his neighbors was my son. And my son introduced me to Khalid. And as I got to know him over time, I started to introduce him to people and places in my network. So what was actually happening? He was actually borrowing my network. So one of the most exciting areas of research right now is social networks and inclusion. So think about the possibility if we all got better at using our networks, borrowing our networks, lending our networks, sharing our networks. Think about the possibilities for inclusion. We can also think about this community idea as being a sharing of gifts. So I share my gifts and strengths with you. Lisette shares her gifts and strengths with you. You share your strengths and gifts back with us. That's how we build community together. But the glue that really holds that together is hospitality. It's really hard to have strong community without hospitality. And we all know, you think about a time in your life where you experienced hospitality. And Janet asked you before to think about a place where you experienced belonging. Hospitality, you probably had food, you had friendship, you had trusting relationships, and you felt included. So in some ways, and this is the work that we're doing through the New Story Group, we're thinking of community as an organizing principle. Not institutions as an organizing principle, not government as an organizing principle, but community as an organizing principle. And then those other things, institutions and organizations and government, then support the possibility that we can build strong communities together. So as you move ahead with your action plan, I would suggest that you really want to think deeply and strategically about community and how we can build an abundant community in this region. Now, before I leave community, I want to just deviate slightly. You know, Socrates said many years ago, 2,000 years ago, in fact, a long time ago, he said the secret of change is to focus your energy not on fighting the old, but on building the new. And that's essentially what I'm talking about today, isn't it? But I want to deviate slightly from that and just give you one old story. Because as we reflect on our region and how vibrant it is, we're all aware that there are also some places in our community that are not so vibrant, not so welcoming, and not so inclusive. So sometimes when we're doing community work, and you will all know this, sometimes we need to do advocacy, right? Sometimes we need to step up and push the boundaries and push the barriers. Now, it's true that large institutional structures will never be the same as community as I defined it. But as we do our advocacy, hopefully what we can do is influence those institutional structures to pick up some of the threads of community. Threads like hospitality, threads like welcoming, embracing diversity, and reducing complex bureaucracy. Just some examples. So the second pillar then is belief in community. The third pillar of change that I think really fits well with the work that you're doing is the power of partnerships. And you are called the Immigration Partnership. So you obviously know a lot about partnerships and you're committed to partnerships. You're dedicated to making partnerships work. And I think that's a very powerful idea in this culture we live in. Our society has become more and more complex over the last 30 years. And the idea that any one organization can complete something as complex as inclusion on their own simply isn't going to work, right? We need to all work together. It's a genuine partnership that's going to make this work. We're not going to create a community of belonging with any one single player. It's going to be lots of partnerships. My experience suggests that there's really two anchors to partnership development, and you will know these when you hear them. And one is about working across differences, and the other is finding common ground. But it's really important that you do both of these well, right? Because sometimes if we rush to finding common ground, but if we haven't paid attention to differences, we stumble. And there's lots of examples in our community and across the country of partnerships that have not worked. And I think one of the clues is to pay attention to differences. Differences in power, differences in income, differences in customs, differences in language. What if people don't speak? How do we deal with that difference? Think about the possible differences that there are. We have to pay attention to those. And as we pay attention to those and listen to each other and begin to work together in understanding those differences, we can then find common ground that can really move partnerships ahead. You know, your partnership work will take you into all areas of our community. As you take those strategic directions and begin to move them into the community, there'll be all kinds of potential for partnerships. And one of the things that I've found over the years is one of my favorite partnership questions is what I call the who question. Who can we invite? Who would understand this issue? Who would really this resonate with? Who might be a barrier here? Oh, but thinking about Socrates. No, who would be with us on this journey? So the who question constantly allows us to look at potential partnerships. This is a society that likes to fix things. So quite often what happens is we have a problem and you say, what can we do? And we try to fix it. And sometimes what I'm suggesting is if you stand back a little bit and ask the who question first, you begin to see what the possibilities are and what the strengths are and who the potential allies are that might then help you to resolve and work on the question and the issue a bit differently. So my third pillar, the power of partnerships. The final pillar I'm suggesting is the wisdom of the collective. Now remember our first pillar was the power of the personal. Well actually the power of the personal can't stand alone. It has to go in concert with the wisdom of the collective. None of us are alone. We're all part of community. So the wisdom of the collective is really an interesting insight what the latest research shows. And maybe some of you know this. And the learning from the research is this, that groups of people make wiser decisions and identify deeper insights than a small group of people or very few people working on their own. So you may have 3 or 4 smart people together and you think you can really figure it out. But the reality is, unless you check those ideas with a much larger group of people, your wisdom isn't probably going to be right on the mark. So I applaud you for playing with some of your ideas and then going out to our community. That's what you did. You had lots of meetings with the community to get their input and help shape these. And I think it's exciting as you move ahead. Don't forget to keep doing that, right? So from time to time, you need to go back to the bigger groups who are going to give you more wisdom and more insight. Now, the main reason, it's interesting from the research, the main reason that larger groups are wiser, and you'll know why, because they're more diverse. Larger groups are more diverse. Diversity matters in decision making, both at the small group level and at the large group level. We know it matters because you get other perspectives that you wouldn't otherwise get. And it also matters because you need to keep paying attention to the fact that you're getting all of those people involved in decision making as opposed to just 1 or 2 people. What we're learning, certainly through the New Story group, but lots of other groups, including your own, is that one of the main ways of gathering the wisdom of the collective is through conversation. Right? It's in conversation that we hear each other, that we listen, we put our own position on hold as we engage with other people, and we try to deepen our work together. So as you act on your action plan, remember to try to have ongoing conversations on an ongoing basis. So that's the fourth pillar, the pillar of the collective. So let me conclude, whether you're thinking about the power of the personal, whether you're thinking about belief in community, the power of partnerships, or the wisdom of the collective, I think at the heart of this inclusion work, even though those four pillars make a huge bit of difference, at the heart of inclusion is really about relationships. It's really about the relationships we have with each other and with ourselves. Because in those relationships, we begin to then gather allies. We begin to think about possibilities and common vision. So imagine if we have strong relationships, if we have all of those four pillars in place, and we have a clear vision, which you do with your three pillars, and a collaborative spirit, then I think we're really in a good position to seed and support the change we need. As being involved in the New Story Group, it's been interesting to watch how conversation about these kind of issues has been such an important part of our work. And even this morning we had a meeting, and Janet was there, and we started at a very technical level in our conversation about a particular issue we were working on. But as we talked, as the conversation deepened, it became more about the heart, it became more about strategy, it became more about inclusion and connecting deeply with the community. So again, congratulations on your work. This community action plan is fantastic, and I look forward to continuing on behalf of the New Story Group to be working with you and in the months ahead. And just to conclude, more than 200 years ago, Victor Hugo, I guess I like old quotes, don't I? Victor Hugo said, "There's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come." So I think the challenge is, let's make inclusion an idea whose time has come in Waterloo Region.